When most people picture prehistoric ocean nightmares, they go straight to the obvious candidates. Mosasaurs, the size of school buses. Plesiosaurs, with necks longer than telephone poles. The Megalodon, which has somehow become the default answer to every question about large aquatic predators despite going extinct roughly 3 million years ago. These are the classics, and for good reason. They were genuinely terrifying. But here's the thing. All of those animals existed during the Mesozoic and Cenozoic eras, the age of dinosaurs, and everything that came after. And while those periods had no shortage of aquatic horrors, there was an earlier time, much earlier, before the first reptile had crawled onto land, before the first tree had grown, before anything with a backbone had figured out how legs worked, when the oceans were already producing monsters that, by any reasonable standard, had no business existing. This was the Devonian period. It ran from approximately 419 to 359 million years ago, and it is sometimes called the Age of Fish, a name that sounds almost quaint until you find out what kind of fish we're talking about. Because the Devonian didn't produce fish in the way we typically imagine them, it produced armored tanks with jaws that worked like guillotines, sharks that were already ancient by the time the dinosaurs arrived, and predators so far outside the normal parameters of what a fish is supposed to be that paleontologists spent decades arguing about where to put them in the family tree. The Devonian Ocean was not a place you wanted to go swimming, and the further you look into it, the more that becomes an understatement. To appreciate what the Devonian Ocean was, it helps to understand what came before it. The preceding period, the Silurian, had its own aquatic fauna, including early jawless fish, sea scorpions, and primitive sharks, but nothing that would particularly alarm a modern marine biologist. The oceans were alive, but relatively tame by the standards of what was coming. The Devonian changed that with remarkable speed, at least in geological terms. A combination of rising sea levels, warm, shallow seas spreading across large portions of the continents, and an explosion of ecological opportunity produced what paleontologists sometimes call the Devonian Nekton Revolution, a rapid diversification of actively swimming, predatory animals that transformed the oceans from a relatively passive environment into something considerably more dynamic and considerably more dangerous. The shallow seas that covered much of what is now North America, Europe, and Australia during the Devonian were warm, well-lit, and rich in food. Reefs built by corals and stromatoporoids, sponge-like organisms that no longer exist, stretched for hundreds of kilometers, and the fish that evolved to exploit these environments did so with an inventiveness that is still astonishing to look at today. And then, sitting at the top of all of it, was Dunkleosteus. If you have encountered one Devonian animal in any context, a documentary, a museum exhibit, a biology textbook, it was almost certainly Dunkleosteus terrelli. And whoever showed it to you was right to single it out, because Dunkleosteus is not a normal fish in any meaningful sense of the word. It is, by most measures, the most terrifying fish to have ever lived. Dunkleosteus belonged to a group called the placoderms, armored fish that dominated the Devonian oceans and came in an extraordinary range of sizes and body plans. Most placoderms were relatively small and inoffensive. Dunkleosteus was neither. Adults reached lengths of between 6 and 8 meters, or 20 to 26 feet, comparable to a large great white shark, and weighed somewhere in the region of 1 ton. The front half of its body was encased in thick interlocking plates of bone that functioned as armor, giving it the appearance of something that was built rather than grown. But the truly remarkable thing about Dunkleosteus was not its size or its armor, it was its jaws. Unlike virtually every other vertebrate that has ever lived, Dunkleosteus did not have teeth in the conventional sense. Instead, it had self-sharpening blades, bony plates at the edge of its jaws that functioned like a pair of biological scissors, with the upper and lower plates grinding against each other every time the mouth closed, keeping their edges razor-sharp through use alone. You will never need to floss if you are a Dunkleosteus, mostly because you will never need to do anything twice. The bite force generated by those jaws has been estimated at up to 7,400 newtons at the tip and potentially over 55,000 newtons further back in the mouth, making it one of the most powerful bites of any fish ever measured, and putting it in the same range as large crocodilians. What makes this even more impressive is the mechanism behind it. Dunkleosteus could open its jaws with explosive speed. Studies on the skull mechanics suggest it could fully open and begin closing its mouth in under 20 milliseconds, generating a suction effect that pulled water and prey directly into its mouth before they had any realistic chance of escaping. It was essentially a biological vacuum with guillotine attachments. Stomach contents and bite-marked remains found in the fossil record confirm that Dunkleosteus fed on heavily armored prey, other placoderms, early sharks, and large invertebrates, and that it regularly bit through armor that would have defeated almost anything else in its environment. There is also evidence, somewhat grimly, that Dunkleosteus practiced something close to selective eating, biting off and consuming the soft parts of prey, while regurgitating the armored portions it couldn't digest, similar to behavior seen in modern sharks. In other words, it was not only powerful enough to eat anything in its ecosystem, it was discerning about it. While Dunkleosteus is the undisputed face of the Devonian, though it technically persisted into the early Carboniferous, the period's oceans also gave rise to the shark lineage, and the Devonian sharks were already doing deeply strange things with their biology. The most famous example is Cladoselache, one of the earliest well-documented sharks, which appeared in the Devonian and was in many ways remarkably similar to modern sharks' streamlined body, multiple rows of teeth, a cartilaginous skeleton. It reached about 1.8 meters or 6 feet in length and was an active, fast-swimming predator that would be immediately recognizable as a shark to any modern observer. The fact that sharks had already converged on essentially their modern body plan within a few tens of millions of years of first appearing tells you something about how effective that body plan is. But the Devonian also planted the seeds for some considerably stranger shark experiments, the most spectacular of which would bloom in the following Carboniferous period, the Helicoprion. Technically a Carboniferous and Permian animal rather than strictly Devonian, Helicoprion was the inheritor of Devonian shark diversity and deserves mention here because it represents the single most confusing fossil in the history of shark paleontology. For nearly a century after its discovery, no one could agree on where the spiral whorl of teeth that defines Helicoprion actually sat in its body. Theories included the nose, the tail, the dorsal fin, and various positions in the jaw. The actual answer that the whorl formed in the lower jaw and rotated backward as new teeth grew, creating a biological buzzsaw, was only conclusively established in 2013 using CT scanning on a remarkably preserved specimen. An 8-meter or 2 6-foot shark with a rotating spiral saw in its mouth. The Devonian legacy in one sentence. Not every giant in the Devonian Ocean was there to eat you. Some of them were there to remind you that evolution has a sense of humor. Titanichthys was another placoderm, a close relative of Dunkleosteus. In fact, and it matched or potentially exceeded its cousin in size, with some estimates placing the largest individuals at over 8 meters or 26 feet in length. It had the same armored front half, the same general body plan, and a skull that was, if anything, even larger relative to its body than Dunkleosteus. By every visual indicator, Titanichthys was a terrifying apex predator. It was not. Analysis of its jaw structure revealed that the bony blades that made Dunkleosteus such an effective killer were, in Titanichthys, small, poorly developed, and entirely unsuited for catching large prey. The current thinking is that Titanichthys was a filter feeder, an animal that swam through the water with its massive mouth open, straining plankton and small organisms from the water column. Like a prehistoric and considerably more armored whale shark, the largest predator-shaped animal in the Devonian Ocean was, in terms of diet, basically a very aggressive vacuum cleaner. This is, depending on your perspective, either deeply reassuring or somehow more unsettling than if it had just been another monster. The Devonian ended badly, as many geological periods do. The late Devonian extinction, which actually comprised a series of extinction pulses spread over roughly 20 million years rather than a single event, eliminated an estimated 70 to 80% of all species on Earth. Marine life was hit hardest. The reef systems that had defined Devonian oceans for millions of years collapsed almost entirely and would not recover to comparable diversity for roughly 100 million years. The placoderms, the armored fish that had dominated the oceans for the entire period, including Dunkleosteus and Titanichthys, went completely extinct, leaving no descendants. The causes are still debated, but the leading hypotheses include a series of oceanic anoxic events, periods where large portions of the ocean were depleted of oxygen, essentially suffocating marine life from the bottom up, combined with dramatic cooling and the effects of land plants, which had only recently evolved and whose spread across the continents may have dramatically altered nutrient runoff into the oceans, triggering algae blooms and further oxygen depletion. What survived and diversified in the aftermath were the sharks, the ray-finned fish, and the early ancestors of the tetrapods, the fish-like animals that were in the process of evolving legs and crawling onto land. The Devonian didn't just produce monsters. It produced the survivors that would eventually fill every ecological niche on the planet, in the water and out of it. The armored giants are gone, but the ocean they built and the evolutionary experiments they ran echo in every fish, every shark, and every land animal that came after them, including us.